Good afternoon, hello, welcome to the TriathlonDan YouTube channel. This video is probably one for the nerds, more specifically the cycling, power, lactate, thresholds, ramp tests, whatever, nerds. I'm going to take my time through this, try and explain the information as best I can. Hopefully I'll understand it, and I'm sure if I understand it, then you will understand it. Now, if anybody has, or is an expert, or has any comments or anything, please do let me know in the comment section down below. This is all new to me. I'm going to try and explain it the best I can, but I am learning as I'm going, so bear with. Now, this video is going to cover two tests that I recently did in the Loughborough University cycling lab. So, I did a ramp test, so a max aerobic power test. A lot of you might be familiar with those sorts of things. It's just a step test that gets harder and harder till you can't pedal anymore. But the thing I was more interested in was the lactate ramp test. Now, this is a sub-max test, so you don't go to full exhaustion, but the power does creep up and up when you have regular blood lactate tests through your ear to check how much blood lactate your muscles are making, how much your body's dealing with, and so on. That then provides a lot of information, which helps with pacing, helps with fuel, so how much do I need to eat to sustain what power, helps with understanding my body, so where am I strong, where am I weak, to alter my training. I went in to do this 6 months out from my main focus of the year. So Ironman Wales is my main focus for this year. I spoke to a gentleman called Stephen Harris who ran this test for me, and it's centered around Wales. So anything I'm doing is around an Ironman distance race or full distance triathlon race. Don't come at me for calling it an Ironman race. And that's what we're going to go with. Firstly, thank you to Lucia who did all the filming for me. She was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much for that. I'll leave your Instagram on screen somewhere now. A triathlete in Loughborough. Give her a follow if you're interested in triathlon. Hopefully she's going to go to the Olympics and take me with her. That'd be great. Anyway, let's have a look at this then. So first of all, I unfortunately had to weigh in on the day, and I weighed in at 96.2 kilos. Ready for excuses? It was the end of the day, all right? I've been a couple of kilos lighter in the morning, but eat and drink during the day. But there were the scores on the door, so let's crack on. Now, I'm not going to read all these things word for word, but I'm going to read some of them because some of it is all of it is useful, but you'd be here all day if I was reading it all. So feel free to pause and read through any of these things if you would like. So the first test that we did, the sub-maximal bike test. So the sub-max bike test is designed to assess your aerobic fitness by measuring your physiological responses to exercise or increasing intensity. The test involved riding 6-minute stages on our turbo trainer. It was a SRM ergometer bike. Intensities were based on the maximal power output you sustained over the last minute of the max test, with the first stage being 40% of this maximal power output. Now, we didn't test it that way around on the day. We did this sub-max test first because I had a good idea of what powers I could do. We just started like quite easy. So we started at about 160 watts or something. We'll come back to that. And basically then ramped it up from there. So then at the end of each stage, so the 6-minute ramps, in the last minute of each ramp, a blood lactate sample is taken. The reason being, 5 minutes is long enough for your body to have sort of settled into that effort and for your lactate to be producing to be an accurate amount versus the power you're putting out. And then we've also got a mask on as well to measure the oxygen uptake that I am breathing, heart rate monitor, etc. I did also take my power pedals, and the readings were almost exactly the same, so I'm happy to use the data from the SRM ergometer. Now, what is blood lactate? What's the point in measuring it?
So we're basically seeing as we slowly increase the intensity of the power that you're riding at, how you're physiologically responding to that in terms of your heart rate, in terms of the amount of oxygen you're using, the amount of carbon dioxide you're producing. And taking all of those data points, that's what allows us to understand basically how you're fueling that exercise, whether it's carbohydrate intensive or whether it's fat intensive. As well as obviously just giving us markers that we're able to predict and work out exactly where those training zones should lie and where those lactate thresholds should lie with the lactate added in as well.
Got it? So what we're working towards is two thresholds, LT1 and LT2. We're trying to calculate what those are so that I can use them for pacing, fueling, and so on. So LT1 is the exercise intensity where lactate values first start to rise above the baseline. Below it, your body's mainly using fats as fuel, so ideally this will occur at a high workload if you're well trained, good aerobic base. And then LT2 is the exercise intensity above which there is a sustained increase in blood lactate concentration, meaning you're relying more on carbs to fuel exercise. Basically, you can't do a huge amount of time above LT2. Let's scroll down a bit further. Now, this table here contains a lot of information. A lot of it is explained further down, so I'm going to leave it there for a second. If you want to look at the individual data, please do pause it and have a read through it. It's really interesting. Obviously, it shows through the stages. So I did 8 stages starting from 155 watts for 6 minutes all the way up to 6 minutes at 330 watts, and within that all the data was taken at various points. You can see that on the table down below.
Where you can see those steps.
Yeah.
Yours is quite nice and well defined.
Yeah.
And like what you normally see, I'll say, so your blue line is your oxygen uptake, your red line is your CO2 being produced. So as when you have a bigger gap between them, that's where you're more fat dominated, or you're being able to fuel more via your fat stores. When you start to get up to this top end, and like what we'll see when you're doing your VO2 max test, where your red line is pretty much over the top of your blue line, that's where you're carb dominated. Yeah. And therefore that's one of the reasons why you'll have a really finite amount of time that you'll be able to perform at that intensity or that power. What we'll get out of today is, as well as your thresholds, as well as that fuel data, is I try and put a few graphs in there that also, if you were going to try and ride at LT1, how much carbs you would need, or if you're going to fuel at 60 grams per hour or 90 grams per hour, how long you'd actually have. Right, perfect. So sometimes that will give you the idea of like, right, that's an element like, oh, that's not particularly feasible. If I want to go at, if you have your target power and you're like, I'm not actually going to be able to get enough fuel in to be able to sustain that. That can be a part of your plan of A, can I get enough in practice, can you get enough in? And B, if not, right, do I need to change my training to try and make myself a bit more efficient, or use more fats as a fuel? It just gives another layer of where you can target it. So some coaches that we work with, this is what they find most interesting in terms of Ironman. Yeah. It's more, some of their guys will be super fit, obviously, and they can, the test on here, their thresholds get picked really well, but because they're real, as you get referred to as like carb munchers, someone that needs loads of carbohydrate to fuel that, it means when you try and do it on an Ironman distance, they fall apart because A, they either can't get enough in, or they just haven't shifted themselves towards being possibly more fat focused, or being able to fuel it slightly better via their endogenous stores rather than having to constantly fuel it via having your gels, your bars,
This then generates these results here, so the sub-maximal bike test training thresholds. So we can see here that my LT1 is at 255 watts and LT2 is at 305 watts. We can see here that obviously that was the same thing on a table as well. So it gives you that zone ideas of where you can work between, above or below. And that's really useful, but it's more useful further down. So the results. My lactate threshold, the first threshold, LT1, occurred at 255 watts with a heart rate of 129 beats a minute, whilst the second turn point, LT2, occurred at 305 watts with a heart rate of 144 beats a minute. Your LT1 is 55% of maximum aerobic power and 60% of VO2 max, whereas LT2 is 66% of max aerobic power and 71% of VO2 max. Quick point on those two. Maximum aerobic power is the final 1 minute in the ramp test, which we did after this test, but of course we've got the information all together now, but I didn't know that at the time. VO2 max is obviously also calculated from that max effort ramp test. So at the time I finished this lactate steps, I didn't have enough information to be able to draw these conclusions. We had to then go and do the max test afterwards. Joe Skipper, if you're watching, I asked about LT3, they didn't really know what you were talking about. Get yourself sorted out before St. George. Anyway, so the summary of that was, currently my thresholds are not limited by my maximal capacity and therefore have a good opportunity to improve. Now what that means is, if my VO2 max was here and my lactate threshold was here, there's not any room for it to improve. I need to improve my VO2 max to be able to improve the lactate thresholds. But because my VO2 max is up here, or max aerobic power is up here as well, and my thresholds are down here, there's room for me to improve my body's efficiency without actually getting any fitter top end power numbers. Does that make sense? I hope so. The later the threshold occurs, so the higher power, the better the aerobic foundation. The stronger the foundation, the better you can recover and adapt from training. Traditionally, long endurance work is considered the best way to improve LT1 and maximum aerobic power. So long endurance miles, zone 2 rides, those sorts of things. So here the advice is to train to improve LT1 is to do long intervals, nothing too hard, staying below LT1. Interestingly, my LT1 is pretty much just the top end zone 2, so it shows that when I'm doing aerobic rides, it is hitting the right zones. but it is different for every individual. Somebody else might have had a higher LT1, which might have took them into their power zone 3. So if you're just doing zone 2 rides, you might be able to get a bit better or do a bit more power and still train the same zones. Training to improve LT2. So this is a bit harder because this is the higher end. So these should be done in zone 5. But if possible, don't get too hung up on the numbers, especially for the short intervals, e.g. 5 minutes. Basically, you should be doing those as hard as you can, but maintaining the intensity for the session. And again here, the shorter intervals increase the speed power output at which LT2 occurs, whilst the longer intervals improve the duration you can sustain at this intensity. So it's basically do a mix, do some short hard efforts and some longer hard efforts, and they're there for different reasons. And then there's some suggestions of what sort of sessions to do, again with Ironman Wales in mind. Now these two lactate thresholds are really important to me because some Ironmans, for example Ironman Barcelona, you might be able to go and hold LT1 for 5 hours and that's your bike split done. But for Wales, it's hilly. It's going to be up and down, so it's very much going to be a case of, right, what power can I do on the flats, and then what power can I do on the hills? So I would say, I can't go above LT2 on the hills, or it's not sensible for me to do so, and I could hold LT1 on the flats. Those sorts of things, I'd have to look at a bit more information, but that's the thought process behind this sort of thing. So we then went on to the max bike test. This is the ramp test. This is a bit easier to explain. You basically just pedal until you can't pedal anymore. And again, the purpose of it is to determine the maximum ability to use the oxygen you breathe in to provide energy for working muscles, known as your VO2 max. The test starts really easy and increases by 5 watts every 15 seconds. Right, so the results were my VO2 max litres per minute. Now I'm going to compare this to 2 years ago when I last did this test in the same lab on the same bike. 2 years ago, I had a absolute VO2 max, so the amount of oxygen I can breathe per minute was 5.1, something like that. So that's actually risen to 5.37, and that I'm really, really happy with that. As you can see, the little speedo diagram says that that is elite. Now, I'm helped by the fact that I'm quite tall, I'm 6'2". I've been training for a few years now, so I'm gonna be quite developed, heart, lungs, and so on. And that's encouraging for me because I know that then if I'm to improve other areas of my fitness, so my weight or my LT1, LT2, you know, there's the potential there for me to be a better athlete. Look a bit further down, we can see here the VO2 max, because of course you have to divide your max aerobic power by the weight and by the litre per minute. I'm only at the competitive club level. Now that's fine for me. If I can be a competitive club rider, that's absolutely fine. But you can just see how my performance in terms of raw VO2 max is a lot different to the that's Liz singing in the shower. Shut up! So here's what Stephen had to say about my power numbers. So the VO2 max is 55.8. It's a good result, places me above average for my age and should be good for good club riders. Elite cyclists tend to have values around 70 to 85 mil, whilst good club cyclists have between 60 to 70. So I am a little bit below where I need to be for that. VO2 max is mainly genetically determined, however it can be improved through correct and specific training. While VO2 max potentially declines gradually with age from 25 to 30 years, I'm 30 now, training history and current training states, blah blah. Basically, losing some non-functional weight will improve this value, which it will. The maximum aerobic power, so that's 460 watts, which is an excellent result. Now that's encouraging, and I don't want to harp on about it, but 2 years ago, I had a maximum aerobic power of 503 watts. So yeah, I need to get back there, but I'm doing everything I can to get there. Anyway, values for club cyclists range between blah blah, so basically this is good. And then as a side note, the heavier you are, the more likely you are to have a higher maximum aerobic power, but then you obviously have to carry that weight going uphill as well. And then it gives some sort of range as to, you know, what normal and elite cyclists have. And again then, some training information, some tips on how to improve VO2 max there, some sessions examples. This is really interesting as well. This is about how my body is using fat versus how it is using carbs. Again, please do pause this and read this if you're interested in it. I've read it through in detail. I'm not sure I fully understand it. I think what it just says is the harder you're going, the more likely your body is to use carbs or the more fats it uses. But what it is essentially saying as well is my body doesn't use a really high amount of fats that can be trained to be better, but the power that it is using its highest amount of fats at is pretty high. So that is there at that 255 watts, which that's a good level of watts for it to be using the most amount of fats it can, but the most amount of fats it can use isn't the highest it could be. Does that make sense? I can basically improve that, and even if it doesn't improve power-wise, it will improve the amount of fats I'm using, so I can do that for longer because I'm able to do that without taking on as many carbs. And the same thing here, just shows you that power curve there with what you're using at different powers. Again, same here, glycogen depletion with varied feeding rates. So this is really useful for fueling. So if I'm looking at, okay, how long am I riding for? What sort of power am I going to hold? Therefore, this is how many carbs I need to eat per hour, according to this test, to be able to fuel that. Particularly for me at the minute, if I'm going to be focusing on dropping some weight, if I'm going to go out and do a ride below LT1 or zone 2 ride, how much do I actually need to be eating to be able to fuel my body? Well, this scientifically tells me how much I need to be eating per hour to fuel my body, so I can make sure that I'm not in a massive calorie surplus, or equally not in a massive calorie deficit. That's really useful. And again, please do feel free to pause this. And this is all the stuff that you don't really get if you're just doing a random lactate test at home. And again here, I'm not going to go through this, I've read this myself. Basically, it's just a summary of those results I've already talked through, some suggestions of where to improve upon, a specific focus on to include working on my LT2 threshold. This is different because of the specific event I'm doing. If I was just doing a long sustained flat ride, I'd be working on my LT1 to get that as high as I can. However, Wales is going to be up and down, therefore improving my LT2 is a big benefit. And then this is a little diagram of where those zones sit in relation to my power zones. So LT1 sits just above the top end of zone 2 and LT2 sits at the top end of zone 4. So roughly where I would have thought, but the idea is that you can move those lactate thresholds independently of your power thresholds, therefore making you a more efficient cyclist and perform better without necessarily having a higher FTP on paper to talk about down the pub. I hope all of that makes sense, and I've genuinely really enjoyed doing this process, but it's only worthwhile if I actually use this information and change my training because of it. So what I'm going to do is, myself and Matt Waterfield of Woodenote Coaching is only my run coach, but I really value his opinion and input into this sort of thing. So we've been through this together. I'm going to go around to his house in the next couple of weeks, and he's going to give me a bit of guidance about my bike training. I feel like bike training is the thing that I really know how to do. I know how to get myself in good shape on the bike, but I'm not just going to put my head in the sand and say, I know best. Nobody give me any advice. I do need to keep listening to people, and I do need to keep listening to other points of view and things because I want to get better. So that is the plan with that. I will of course share that journey as part of that as well. I hope this hasn't come across as a massive willy wave. If anything, it helps that I put out less power in the ramp test than I did about 16 weeks ago just on my own on Zwift, so that's handy. But yeah, really useful. If you fancy doing something like this, I'm sure other universities do it. I think the University of Derby does something similar, perhaps Bath and some other universities, but Loughborough is, the leading sports university in the world, if not definitely the UK, so it is really, really worthwhile doing. I'm just lucky that I don't live a million miles away from it. So there we go. Any questions in the comment section down below. Hope you've enjoyed that, you bunch of nerds, and I will see you tomorrow at 4 PM. Laters.